there's one very interesting sense in which Obama isn't a novice, in which in fact he's very experienced, which is in persuading people that there are new ways to organize themselves. What really distinguishes this election, I think, is that it's the first election that was really won on the internet. Because if you look at the campaign contributions to Obama, nearly 50% of them came from individuals contributing very small amounts, and that was almost all an internet campaign. So I think he's the first person who's understood that there's another way of doing things. It doesn't have to be through the mainstream media. The effect of that has been that Fox News, that toxic television channel, am I allowed to say that?
I love Fox. Free speech on the BBC.
Had very much less effect on this election than they did on the last one. If you remember, the last one was practically won by Fox swift-boating Kerry. In this one, people weren't so persuaded. They weren't paying so much attention. But the other thing I think that's important about that method of organisation, of getting individuals, several million individuals, to stump up quite small amounts of money for a campaign instead of getting money from big lobbies like the National Rifle Association, is that those individuals feel that they really have a stake in this government. And that's something that we haven't had here for a long time. So I think there's a new kind of idea of democracy in America as a result of this campaign.
You, sir. Bang in the middle there. Yes, with spectacles on.
Are these soldiers actually coming home, or are they sent to Afghanistan?
Well, that's a point he was about to make, but let's just stick with Brian Eno. Let's just stick with the question for the moment. Brian Eno.
Well, although the economic news has overshadowed everything recently, one of the real contributors to Barack Obama's success was the fact that he was not George Bush, and he's very much stood against the policies of George Bush. And one of the impediments that McCain faced was that he didn't do that clearly enough. I was against the Iraq war from the very beginning. I wrote to Jack Straw actually before it started and got the dodgy dossier sent to me, which in an afternoon on the internet I was able to find was largely untrue. So, you know, it doesn't say much for the research of most of our MPs actually, who didn't have the time to do that.
Well, Jack Straw, who was then Foreign Secretary, sent you the dossier.
It was in a package, and it was signed by Jack Straw, actually,
right.
the letter, though I'm sure it was just signed like many others were.
No, I would sign my own letters. I always sign my own letters.
And he says it was a dodgy...
It was the famous dodgy dossier. I've still got it.
You're keeping very quiet.
I'm waiting to be invited to speak, unusually.
So a lot of the initial energy for Barack Obama, I think, came from a large number of Americans who felt that they'd been lied to, misled, that government was sort of heavy artillery fire conducted above their heads. They had very little involvement in it. And as I say, one of the revolutions of the Obama campaign was that he very much involved citizens, and they really care about what this government now does in a way that they haven't done in the past.
Do you want to come back on this before we go on to the other members of the panel?
I'll listen to the other members.
But you can answer him because he said you produced a dodgy dossier, and Barack Obama said the war was dumb, and you were Foreign Secretary at the time of it and defended it.
I still do. Let me just say this. I thought about the Iraq war, obviously, because I not only defended it, but I was the man who wound up in the crucial debate in the middle of March 2003. And I thought about it a great deal, not least because, as it turned out, the intelligence base for the war was wrong. But I just say this, that in the words of a famous philosopher, whilst history is understood backwards, life has to be lived forward. And if I'm being asked the question, Brian, about whether I would have made the same decisions again on the information available at the time, the answer to that is yes, I would. And whatever, just put the so-called dodgy dossier aside for 1 second. What was also the case was that although there was a dispute, a very profound dispute internationally about whether military action was the solution, there was no effective dispute in the Security Council or elsewhere, but that Iraq posed a threat to international peace and security.
And if you had the information that you have now, would you have not advocated war?
Look, I mean, the truth is, the question really is, what would we have done with that information? We didn't have that information. almost every other country in the world shared our opinion about the threat that Iraq posed.
But they weren't all ready to invade.
No, I accept
we
that.
were exceptions.
Well, we weren't complete exceptions by any means, let me say, and there was a very wide international coalition that went into Iraq. I also just say this. I mean, let us see 15, 20 years where Iraq is, but for all the terrible things that have happened, I think we can now see Iraq emerging. It is an emerging democracy, and it will be, in my judgment, a better and more stable place than ever it was under Saddam.
But you did make an interesting point. You said it's easy to look back, and history doesn't work that way. You have to take decisions looking forward. Yes. I'm just asking you, since you now know about the weapons of mass destruction, you can look back and say, well, had I known that rather than what I was told, would I have gone along with the war? You can answer that question.
Yes, I'm going to. Plainly, if all of us had known what we subsequently learned, which was there were no significant weapons of mass destruction.
But I learned that afternoon.
Hold on,
hang on a second. Well, with great respect, Brian, that was not the position of...
What I feel is going on at the moment is something that I call the socialism of cowardice. It's where you sort of back into some form of socialism without admitting that you're doing it because you don't want to frighten anybody. And what it amounts to is that you nationalize the risks and leave the profits private, effectively. And this seems to me like the worst of all possible worlds.
Brian, that is simply not true. Since
you have spoken quite a lot. I don't want to stop you. We all enjoy hearing you, but I've got to let the other members of the panel have their go.
So what's happened in the last few years, actually, is that two huge ideological bubbles have burst. One is the idea of a unilateral, powerful superpower being able to control the world effectively, which it clearly can't, and luckily Obama seems to realize that and wants to be multilateral and to share with us a little bit more and hear what we have to say. But the other bubble that's burst is the ideological bubble of market fundamentalism, that if you left the market alone, it would be the best for all of us. That clearly didn't work. That's why we're in the mess we're in. So we sort of understand that we have to move to some kind of a different philosophy, but the way we're doing it, seems to me, is so apologetic, and so we're sort of backing into it without actually grasping the problem and saying, it really doesn't work. You know, the free market, untrammeled, will produce the kind of result we've seen, and it will do it on a regular basis. So. Okay. I'm a big supporter of the BBC. I don't actually own a television, which is rather a confession to make, but I do listen to the radio a lot, and I think particularly the BBC World Service is one of the great inventions of civilization, actually. It's an amazing cultural invention.
It doesn't cost £139.50 a year to run it.
I remember when
paid for by the taxpayer, the World Service.
Yeah.
Yes.
Paid by the Foreign Office.
Foreign Office, yeah.
That's right. And Margaret Thatcher once cut £5 million of their £25 million budget. And I wrote to her to say that was the cost of one wing of an F-16 fighter. We'd just bought 78 of them, I think.
You write a lot, don't you, to ministers, one way or another?
They never get back to you.
And I support the licence fee. It's one of the reasons why we've got good public sector broadcasting in this country, in contrast to America and the kind of very malign influence that institutions like Fox TV have followed.